people want to interpret one way or the other. So for me, it's, and for the people that I represent, it is very clear that we are now talking about a model based on sharing of the economic success of works throughout their exploitation lives, which means that we're going to have a conversation about the format this needs to take. Voilà. And I remember once when the parliament vote happened, I had somebody from our sector coming to me and saying a little bit pissed off, "Are you happy now? You got what you wanted, right?" And I was like, man, I'm not happy. This is going to be very hard. It's going to be hard on the business to adjust. It's going to be hard on us to make the case in each country, depending on each different legislations we have to adjust. But there is one thing that I'm proud of. I'm not happy, I'm proud that in Europe, we have found a way to say these things very clearly in European legislation. So, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but voilà, I think that's the gist of it.
You said a lot of great things, so thank you so much. Thank you. Good points. Then we'll move on to Iban from Spain. And he is a Spanish member of the European Parliament from the Socialists and Democrats group. And before joining the European Parliament, you were involved in discussions on culture and authors in Spain, right? And the European Parliament, and in particular your party, have been very important to strengthen Chapter 3 of the directive and to introduce both an appropriate and proportionate right to remuneration and a right of revocation. So I was wondering, what is your view on this directive and how can it lead to a more fair remuneration for the authors?
Thank you, Kate. First of all, let me be grateful for the invitation to this tiny and beautiful theater. That is a magnificent, spectacular place to speak about culture. The first thing is, and linked with Pauline said, from my point of view, is absolutely against the spirit of the intellectual property and even the spirit of the Berne Convention, the buyout contracts, because this is made, the royalties system is made just for the very sake to maintain, to keep a constant string of revenues for creators and authors, for an entire, a whole cultural and artistic life. And there's no point in buyout, in deprive everything from the first point to deprive for the rest of their life, no? Because I think, as I said, that is against from the very Berne Convention. But regarding to the question, I think the Chapter 3 is a magnificent step forward in the situation, in the situation of the question of the fighting by the creators for the rights. I think things like transparency, things like the mechanisms even to readjust the contracts, mechanisms about to fill the value gap. I think it's so important that it's the first time in the entire world life to have this kind of law. And I think it's a very great scaffolding to work on. I think, like Pauline said, it's not the end of anything, but it's the beginning, and it's a very good beginning. And I think that as you happened with the same directive, you had to have a very big work, a very big effort to convince the national legislators in order to implement a smooth translation of the directive, because a lot of things the key point is a national level. In a lot of ways, in a lot of things, because even if any country are thinking about a literal implementation, is not complying with the very directive, because the directive only make some principles, but the national members have to fill on these principles with some systems, and many of them might be so complex, because there are a lot of things that I listened in the latter panel and in this panel as well, related to things that we need. And we need, first of all, we need to empower the part of the artist, the part of the creators. And I have a good example of this. In my country, in Spain, even before this directive was approved, we could state a new legislative norm that state the right for, as an example, screenwriters to have the entitlement to publish rules about for example, things like prices, things like conditions of contratation, and it's so much important, because most of the creators and artists are not in a situation of a collective bargaining, to be part of collective bargaining. Many of them, most of them, are professionals and freelancers and aren't able to be part of a collective bargaining. But we have another systems, and I think, like we made in Spain, this directive provides the chance to do so to the other members of the European Union. I'm vice chair of the Jury Committee. Jury Committee is appointed to look after the implementation of the European directives at national level. I think it's so important, our own tasks about the looking after of this. I think next month will be so crucial in order to know if we are able to make a new step forward or not. But I'm so optimistic about this, because I think we have a lot of assets at our hand. I think this very directive is so important to do so, and I think we'll have a good future in advance. But we have to be so conscious and so concerned as well about what would be the future of this. But as I said, and let me end with this. I'm optimistic with the future of the creator sector in Europe and at a national level. And as I said at the beginning, I think it's something that is absolutely like the spirit of the continental law in an artistic way in Europe.
I'm glad to hear that. You're optimistic. Give him a big hand. So our last panelist, Marco, you've already met. Thank you so much for joining us for another panel. You've already been introduced, but you are the head of copyright unit at the European Commission, right? And with the copyright directive, this is the first time that the EU recognizes that authors and performers are actually in a very weak bargaining position when they negotiate their contracts. So I'm wondering if you can present Chapter 3, maybe Articles 18 to 23, and explain why it can improve authors and performers' remuneration.
Sure, thanks a lot, and thanks everybody for the patience to listen to me actually also in this panel. I will try actually to be helpful for the discussion, hopefully. Yes, I mean, I think let me go back to what I said in the previous panel about the market regulation. I think that this is something which is even more true actually in this chapter, in chapter 3 than for other parts of the directive. And I think, I mean, other speakers have already mentioned that, but it's really the first time that European legislation gets into copyright contracts in such an exhaustive way. I mean, of course, there are bits and pieces of things also in other directives, but you know, it's really the first comprehensive regulation actually of copyright contracts, and I think this is very important because you know, it gives, as Pauline was saying, you know, a clear recognition at European level of the fact that creators tend to be, or are, let's even face it and say it like that, in a weaker bargaining position actually when they sign contracts for the exploitation of their content. And this triggers all the intervention logic in this chapter, but more broadly, I would even say really the justification for European intervention in this area. Now, a lot existed already in a scattered way here and there in national legislation. And I think this is, in a way, an opportunity, but also a challenge to some extent of the implementation of this chapter, because I think that what member states, and I've seen it actually in the first discussion, will start doing is, first of all, looking at what they already have in their legislation, and then they will have to complement it actually with the new rules. But the challenge is to make sure that this complementarity actually really takes place, and that member states do not stop at just, you know, saying, well, we already have something, so we keep it as it is. Because I think if there is something where I really agree with Pauline, we also want the directive to bring a change, actually. So I think, you know, there has been a lot of work, a lot of investment from policymakers in this chapter, and we really want, you know, few years down the line to be able to say, well, this has made a difference for creators. Now, you ask me, you know, to describe, you know, this chapter. There are 5 articles. 3 were in the original Commission proposals, 2 have been added by the European Parliament. It has been a not easy negotiation, also this part of the directive. Maybe it has been less visible, let's say, in the public opinion, maybe less visible in the social media, but I can tell you, you know, very much visible in the negotiation rooms, actually, because we spent a lot of hours in the trialogues, for example, with the Parliament and the Council, and also, you know, with the help of different stakeholders to get it through. I think, you know, the first provision is the principle of fair and proportionate remuneration, which is also the part of the directive which came later, let's say, because it comes from the Parliament, and where I think we still have a lot of questions mark on how member states will concretely implement it, and then, I mean, maybe we can discuss it a bit further. But I think it's quite a beautiful construction, if I may, because, I mean, I say the same for Article 17, but, you know, I like this directive. You have the principle, which is Article 18, and then you have a toolbox of different mechanisms which are there to help creators, basically, to strengthen their bargaining powers during the exploitation of their content and during the life of the contract. So it all starts with the transparency, which is Article 19, and, you know, this was already a very strong article in the Commission proposal, and there were a lot of discussions, but in the end, I mean, it went through pretty much as proposed by the Commission, and we believed since the beginning that the starting point is to make sure that the creators are informed about what's going on, basically, during the life of their contract, because there is a lot that follows from that in terms of being stronger. And then there are, you know, articles on contract adjustment and on the revocation of the rights, which is something which may happen, you know, maybe only in pathological solution, but is a new right given to creators. And this is also a new right, basically, to renegotiate the contract if there is some unexpected, success, for example, that come up from the exploitation of the right. And then there is an alternative dispute resolution mechanism, which is a little bit the closure of the system, and that we hope will help, to make sure that this article is applied in practice. So it's a toolbox. There are a lot of interesting and beautiful things into it. There is also, let's face it, a lot of flexibility for member states, and this was partly, as often in difficult negotiations, the result of compromises, but partly was, since the beginning, the recognition of the fact that there is not one-size-fits-all solution, because the sectors are different, the national traditions are different, the starting point in national legislation is different. So let's say that as such, margins of maneuver for implementation are not a bad thing, but obviously we don't want this to become an excuse, basically, to avoid the implementation of this article. And the last thing I wanted to say is that there is a lot, actually, of these margins of maneuver that will have to be filled in by dialogue with interested parties. And I think this is something which was very much already in the Commission original proposal. There are a lot of recitals, even more now, with the final text of the directive, with a role for stakeholder dialogue, a role for collective bargaining agreements, a role for consultation with interested parties. And we really believe that this is going to be key, actually, for a successful implementation, to make sure that this broad framework is really implemented in a very concrete way on the ground.
Yeah, thank you so much. Give him a hand for that speech. Going back to you, Simon, and the buyout, and with the sort of fast evolution of the online audiovisual market, and new players, we have Netflix, Disney, Amazon, all sorts of new audiovisual platforms being launched almost every week. And do you think there's a risk that buyouts will be even more common now because there's more and more of these platforms, more and more things being produced, and they want it out there, they want it quick? Do you think it's becoming more and more common? And how could we avoid it?
I don't know how we'll avoid it. I think, it is becoming more common, but you've got huge dominant people in America, major corporations who are just breaking the marketplace. They're effectively saying, the copyright, if I write something, it's my copyright. That's the way the law works currently. That's what it is. And they're coming up to me and saying, actually, it's not yours at all. It is. So I don't do the technical stuff very well, but I as a writer, it's more immediate than that. You're negotiating with something that doesn't belong to you. But in terms of stuff that's going online, then you enter the realms of streaming and what your value is from a stream anyway, which is a whole difficult point, because you may find that depending on what the projected usage is online, that to take some money up front is better for you. But this is where we get into the whole transfer of value and streaming. It's not just buyouts that are devaluing us. This is a much bigger pool of problems. But I'll keep it limited to here because I know we're talking about buyouts.
So the American market and their way of working is now influencing the European.
Well, they're global markets
exactly,
now. That's
yes.
the big problem. And without some form of global legislation, which the legislators amongst me might be able to talk to me about, but I don't know where that solution comes from, because all governments are different. There are different market forces on each of those governments. The European Union has been incredibly useful because it's united, but now sadly our country is outside that, which is really depressing. But so I don't have an immediate solution, but all I know is that in terms of the big players, from an artist's point of view or a writer's point of view, you've just got to learn to stand up to it. We can't all go on strike. Maybe we could. The writers did it in Hollywood some years ago. But that's the only way the writers can really make their voice known, is to not do it, because there is value in what we do. They need us. And if we just go, okay, here's a $5, I'll do it then, we create no future for ourselves and the people that come from us. I know it sounds very simplistic, but it is the truth.
Yes, yes. Have you ever experienced losing a job because you refuse to do a buyout? I mean,
I haven't lost.
do they go that far? Like, will they?
It depends what the job is. I mean, if somebody comes to me and says, "Well, yada yada, I would love you to do it," and then you go and they say it's a buyout, and I say, "Well, look, is it?" And if they say yes, then I just don't take the conversation any further because
Well
it's
done.
pointless. Well, it's pointless, you know.
It's very hard for a lot of composers to do that, and I
It's-
think it's very important that we do.
It is, and the thing is that there's lots of other composers in this room who've been lucky, like I have, to sustain careers out of copyright, this residual income, as we were all talking about. Yeah. And we've got to find a way of getting the young people to understand that if they sell their future, they've sold their future. It won't come back. It will never come back. And we're at a critical. Buyouts have been around for years, but we're at a really critical point now with the globalization of all these businesses that we have to do something. It's not like, oh, I'll get away with it, I'll do one or two. We've all got to not do it because they need us, you know, unless the AI thing takes over, which is a bit of a sort of, that's a whole sidebar, which I didn't really want to drag into, but...
So it should really be against the law.
Well, yeah, effectively. I mean, if I write something, I'm protected by copyright.
Yeah.
Or whoever I sign my copyright to.
Yeah.
So you think that, I would like to think that the laws exist to protect me already.
Exactly.
But somewhere along the line, we're being told they don't. Or they're not applicable.
Exactly. And so just to ask you a question, Marco, is it still possible to bypass the principle of appropriate and proportionate remuneration? And why is it still possible to bypass it, if it is?
I mean, let's face it. I mean, Article 18 has quite a lot of flexibility for member states to implement it.
You mean, sorry, not to interrupt, to negotiate? You mean to make your own deal? Or
I mean,
what do you mean by flexibility?
The flexibility means that, you know, this could be implemented by provisions in national law about rights in the contract. So basically a right to have a proportionate remuneration in the contract. It could also be implemented through collective bargaining, to collective management, for example. It could also be implemented maybe in different ways, but, and also, you know, talking about the buyout, there is a recital saying that, you know, lump sums, you know, should not be the rule, but they are still allowed by this article. So, you know, there is a lot of flexibility there, which I think is difficult to say, well, will member states who implement things in different way be bypassing or circumventing the article as such? I would say probably not in many cases, because it's the legislation which leaves flexibility, and to some extent, I also think that at this stage, this is a fair result of the fact that we're talking about different sectors, different member states, different business practices. Now, as I said, we also need to make sure that whatever member states do brings a change and brings an improvement, but there is not a one-size-fits-all in Article 18. So I'm afraid, you know, I have to be a little bit tentative, let's say, in the way we approach this, because it's a complex matter. The directive leaves a lot of margins. The result needs to be there, but there may be different ways to get to this result. And I think we really need to see, you know, in the next year, what member states propose to do, basically, to implement it, and in the next years after this has been implemented, whether this has brought sufficient results or not. And it may be that this is an area where, you know, this directive may be a first step towards more in the future. But, you know, I think we need to be aware of the fact that there is not a one-size-fits-all. Yeah. And let's see how this works in practice.
Pauline, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so it's true that we have a lot of flexibility in Article 18, but there is one thing which is not flexible. It's that Article 18 has to be implemented. So if it has to be implemented, it means that each member state must review the existing systems and somehow evaluate if these systems are satisfactory or not. given the overall purpose of this chapter, which is to provide reasonable success sharing, economically speaking, to creators. So I think that's an enormous plus for people who are trying to bring this conversation to the table and find the solutions which, if we are not going to kid ourselves, are going to be collective solutions to put this into place in a way that works. In our sector, it's particularly important because we have a very patchwork-like situation with regards to proportionate remuneration, or whatever you want to call it. I know that there are debates in semantics, which frankly I'm not interested in. What I'm interested in is the result and the concept itself. In that regard, in Europe, we really have, for audiovisual creators, a very different situation from country to country. You're going to have collective rights management for broadcasting in a country, and in the neighboring country you're not going to have anything, and you're going to have buyouts in that particular, for that particular exploitation. So what Article 18 gives us is the opportunity to review what's going on and to see where we can reasonably consider solutions that are collective, either through collective rights management or collective bargaining, where that's possible, joint remuneration rules like in Germany, in order for us to make progress. The idea here not being to hinder the economic development of business, especially, for example, I mentioned broadcast. We all know that broadcasting is maybe in a different situation than it was 20 years ago with competition from online platforms and so on. Okay, that's, I mean, these are things that we can absolutely discuss collectively in order to make sure that we can correct the situation with regards to the actual payment over time that our people get. And one thing that I didn't mention in the introduction is that this logic of ongoing payment, I mentioned the unpaid work for development, which is really a very, very common thing for our people. We also have the same thing for promotion, by the way. But we also have a population of 85% freelancers with no access to social benefits whatsoever. So that's something to consider as well. Ongoing payments have a play there, which I should have mentioned in the introduction. Maybe one final thing, and then I'll shut up, promise. We are talking about global platforms and ongoing payments, and the fact that maybe buyouts for worldwide exploitation are becoming common in Europe, a thing that we never thought could be possible because we have, as creators, IP. In a way, we are authors, and as such we have IP. Well, it turns out that in the US, where the equivalent of my community in Europe, filmmakers, they don't have authorship status, but they have unions, and they have successfully negotiated a collective bargaining agreement giving them access to ongoing payments covering the exploitation worldwide. This coming from an industry which, granted, is very different from ours, but if we're talking about the risk-taking of the business, is in exactly the same dynamics. So, I mean, at some point we have to ask ourselves as Europeans, if we have agreed that the concept of authorship makes sense, how can we not even consider the issue of the impact of globalization on our authorship? How can we give up? We cannot. We cannot. So it's going to be very tricky and very ugly and complicated. We have jurisdiction issue. I was talking about that with somebody in the audience before. So the finding the right format for that to happen is going to be tricky because we don't have the equivalent of what our American colleagues have in terms of social dialogue and collective bargaining. But it is essential for our community to get there. And I'm sure that we have sufficient imagination to come up with solutions that make sense in that department.
And just to clarify, when you talk about collective bargaining, you talk about the unions and the organizations to stand up for their authors.
Well, I mean...
And to bargain on everybody's behalf.
What collective bargaining would mean that if we were talking only about social dialogue, but we're talking here about copyright, we're talking about authors' rights, so it's slightly different. I mean, from a legal standpoint, I'm sure there are some things that will come up and that will be pretty tricky in that department. However, what the directive gives us is the opportunity to trigger a collective discussion that can be based on a model that is close to collective bargaining. Mm-hmm. Take the joint remuneration rules in Germany. Mm-hmm. It's not collective bargaining. The words that you use are not collective bargaining, but in effect, you're having a collective conversation to somehow get the right value out of your exploitation rights when they're being used by whomever.
Yeah, and Iban, you mentioned collective bargaining earlier. Do you have any thoughts of how that could, how we could use that or benefit from that? Like we have now, for instance, Netflix is they're opening, local production offices to produce Nordic content or other content in parts of Europe. How can we do it on our terms? How can we collectively sort of
about Netflix and the other platforms, there are a lot of things we can talk about. For instance, the question of taxation that is so important, and taxation might have the tools to the government to deal with this kind of solutions as well. But first of all, you and Simon have described it a situation, a global tendency, overwhelming global tendency. And the good point is, first of all, the good point is politics have answered to this, and have answered with this directive that has hardly 1 year, no more than this. And even now, the governments have about more or less another year to implement definitely the directive. I describe it as my first speaking. I describe the directive like an scaffolding, and might be a better metaphor would be a tree. The directive is a tree with branches, but bare branches that we have to fill with leaves at national level, and that's the point in we are. We have to look forward with the future, to be aware about the future, to make pressure at national level, as you did at the European level, but look forward, because you have a very powerful tool, that is the directive, that you didn't have in the past when you deal with this kind of problems. But what would be the way to deal with Netflix and to try to balance the different positions? That is the key point of the problem. I don't know exactly what would be, but I know that this directive and the acts that might be approved at national level might have, as the directive has, complex ways to try to balance the question. And I think I began with this. I think it might be, it has to be related with the taxation shake as well, because it's the whole coin, the two parts of the coin, the taxation for one side, and the implementation of new rights and the protection of the right holders and creators.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Simon, do you have any comments on this? Or
well, one thing just occurred to me, I assign my rights, my performing rights, which are currently trying to be grabbed everywhere, to PRS. And therefore, I can't do a buyout on my performing rights because I've assigned them to them. And, I think that this, it's slightly different in the America, but here it's vital. And I think collective management is going to have a much stronger voice going forward. I think the artists will require it to have, because we do have a protection there, which is possibly not being enforced. Although, of course, PROs cannot get involved in the negotiation of contracts. That's a separate thing. But, if you assign your right to PRS, that's where it is, talk to PRS.
Yeah, that's good. Good comment. Are there any questions from the audience about, flexibility of the law, or, what can we do about these buyouts? Yeah, if you can we'll get you a microphone, and if you can just tell us who you are and the question.
Hi. My name's Brendan Gallagher. I'm from Sydney, Australia. I'm a board member of APRA. I'm the vice chair of the Asia Pacific Music Creators Alliance, and I'm a member of the executive committee of the International Council of Music Creators. CM met recently in Paris, which is why I'm here and not at home fighting bushfires. And in our recent meeting in Paris, the buyout scenario exercised our minds collectively. And one of the issues, or some of the issues that came up, were the complexity of the arguments about and the definitions of the rights of a creator, particularly as Simon mentioned, trying to convince young people not to be involved in these buyouts. For instance, you know, the idea of back end, front end, that kind of thing. So my question is, how do you simplify the message to convince a generation that doesn't subscribe to referential resources and works on a peer-to-peer basis? And whose responsibility is it to educate them?
A good question. So yeah, how can we enlighten the younger generation to take care of their royalties?
I certainly think this is where collective management organisations come in. I think they have the resource to really get deeply into an education programme, because we administer their future if they get to have it. It's a really tough one to do, as I'm sure you appreciate, Brendan, but we just have to get very vociferous with it, and we need to mobilise, if that's probably the wrong expression, but we really have to get on it now. And I think it's incumbent upon the authors on the boards of all collection societies to really make this a high priority. Because then a lot of the young ones will feel like, one, that their collective organisations are doing something for them, and they might get to see that actually they're looking at their future. Those that actually want a career in it really need to get behind this thinking in order to protect their own futures.
Yeah, and also that their work has a value, that it doesn't only last for 1 week or 1 year, but it can last for many years. Any more questions? I will just let this gentleman choose whoever holds their hands up.
Thank you. My name is Cécile Desprang from the Society of Audiovisual Authors. I first would like to thank EXA for organizing this panel. It's a very important topic of the directive, but it has been discussed during the negotiation, and unfortunately it might continue to be discussed at the implementation level. My question is for Marco Giorello of the Commission on Article 18 on proportionate remuneration. How can the Commission ensure that Article 18 will not just be copy-paste in the implementation stage? What can you do to ensure that it will deliver mechanism that will ensure authors get royalties on the exploitation of their work, whatever the mechanism? But is it something you think you can monitor and discuss with member states, that the implementation is not just copy-paste, but some mechanisms are put in place if there is still sectors where there is no mechanism ensuring royalties are paid to authors for the exploitation of the works?
But I think we are doing it. I mean, if there is one thing which I mentioned before, but where I can reassure you, we have been hammering member states on, and even we had a meeting 5 days ago on the remuneration chapter, is the fact that we think they need to go beyond the cut and paste, and they need, first of all, to start by having stakeholder consultation and stakeholder dialogue. And we asked everybody, for example, in the last meeting, to bring to the room what practically they were thinking to do to implement this chapter. So the message is coming regularly every time that we are meeting member states in the contact committee. For the time being, I mean, it's a little bit what I was saying in Article 17. The feeling is really early days. There is a lot of consultation ongoing, a lot of questions coming from member states. we need to see, I mean, in few more months where we are with that, but on the fact that this article needs to have a practical implementation and, these leaves needs to be put on the branches, I think is something that really I can tell you very clearly that we have been telling member states since the beginning, and we will repeat it even in all next occasions. Then let's see how far we go with that. I think it would be useful, thinking a little bit outside the box now that all of you as a stakeholder also help us, and this will be difficult in the short term, but to measure the impact of what is going to be done at the national level, because I think, we are all in agreement about the fact that the changes needs to be brought about, but then at some point we needed to measure them, and I'm sure, that the discussion is going to be ongoing for some more time, but yes, we're looking into it proactively.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, just one comment there.
I think one of the leaves that's going to be on the tree very quickly.
I like this metaphor. It's a tree with leaves.
Yeah.
With branches that will put leaves on it. Great, yeah.
Branches or leaves, is the fact that we need strong collective representations for our professions. And I think maybe, at least in the audiovisual sector, that's something that is not really there. And the directive will have the very interesting effect that when you call on member states to have these stakeholders consultation, you're going to tell to my people that indirectly they have to show up and they have to have an opinion and they have to build their cases and they have to little by little bring their own representativity as an asset on the table, so they have to organize better. And that is incredibly useful for us on the long term. So this incentivized to have collective discussions is really an incredible also step forward in our culture of representing our crafts. And I think that's really also maybe something we didn't really consider in advance, but in the end will prove to be really useful, including for training young people entering in these jobs with maybe not a real sense of the value of their rights, because after all of this is about evaluating the value of what you do, which is quite tricky when you start. But this sort of culture of better self-care as a professional will maybe somehow be built on this, which would be really good.
Thank you. We have time for just one final question, and then we'll have the final words here. Sound in the microphone?
Yeah, I'm on. So,
There you are.
I'm Alphonse Karabuda, and I'm a composer and EXA president. And I have a question, possibly to Marco, and it regards one part of the author's rights, that is the moral rights, and the relation with moral rights also to buyouts. Some buyout models, like Epidemic Sounds and companies like that, depends on making the author anonymous. It's really making them anonymous, putting everything in a bag of music, and it's all you can eat or all you can listen to for a company. So where does that fit in with the transparency triangle and the respect for the author's rights?
Marco?
It's a tricky question. I think the best I can say is that, we think about that, because of course, the lawyer's answer is that moral rights are not harmonized at European level, so strictly speaking, we are talking about a national competence. Obviously, I think that there may be ground to look at what you mentioned, indeed, through the prism of the transparency, because the fact that an author may want or because of whatever business practice remains anonymous should not be an excuse not to give all the rights that the chapter brings about. But the fact remains that if you frame it as moral right, it's a bit difficult to get into that at European level, because strictly speaking, this is something which at the moment remains national competence. But we will think about that.
Thank you.
And then Iban wants
Yes,
comment.
I'd like to add that, as I mentioned at the beginning, I said that this privation of moral rights are strictly against the spirit of the Berne Convention. But more besides of this, it's directly illegal in a lot of countries of Europe, as mine. It's directly illegal, and we have to grant that in the other of the continent, and taking advantage of this sad news that we had last week about the leaving of UK, we have a more level playing field to try to harmonize this kind of question in the rest of Europe, as is the spirit of the continental law.
Thank you. Simon, do you have any final advice to all the composers out there? And
Most of them I can see have been doing it longer than me, I think.
all the younger ones?
The young ones. I mean, I can only reiterate what I've been saying is maybe talk to us, some of us who've been doing it a long, long time, so we can really explain to you the value of, you know, having something with copyright attached to it and residual income, and that's what you really want to aim for in your life, not a quick 200 or 300 quid in your bedroom for doing something, because you won't be paying the rent if you do that. And we have to make that abundantly clear, and we should put a lot of effort. And I know the Ivers Academy and many other organisations, Extra and stuff, are doing that. But it's a key thing, and it's so hard to convince somebody who's on the way up. But we've got to do it somehow, because if we don't, the whole thing's going to get pulled from under us.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Pauline, Marco, Iban, and Simon. And let's hope that... Oh, okay. I was just looking at the time, trying to be very on time. Okay, we'll do some more questions then. We'll have more applause later.
Want more money.
So, Luis, do you have a question?
Thank you. I'm Luis Ibars, film composer from Spain, and I agree. We are in a global business model, and I agree, and I'm very thankful with your passionate answers, Ivan and Marco, in the defense of our author rights system. But I ask you for maintain a strong voice, because once you said here is the directive, the copyright directive, we need to remain on the same strength of the voice of defense of our author rights. And on this side of the audiovisual creators, as we have Pauline too here, I have been studying the Spanish map a little bit, and I'm afraid directors, important directors and composers and screenwriters have been signing buyouts contracts. There's something that I'm waiting the tools of the directive just to fight against it. But in the meanwhile, I'm afraid I have heard about the revocation right, in a weak revocation rate, adoption, because the audiovisual companies are very strong on the idea of have the possibility of making business with the product, of course. And we are going to suffer a lot to apply this revocation right. It looks like we need a strong voice to remain educational voice, to remain our rights on the audiovisual level, because if not, we will be really the weaker creators level on the application of this law. What do you think?
Is this for Iban?
For example.
Yeah, for example, Iban, go for it.
No, I totally or almost totally agree. But I think your position is not as weak as you think, because the directive has changed this always for the rest of your lives. You have a very powerful tool in your hands, and you have to use it more. Powerful than the audiovisual companies, more powerful than this, were Google or Netflix, and you know it very well, and you achieved this directive that is so important. So as I said, I look forward the future. I think that we are going to be able to achieve these points, and even trying to tame this complexity that has this article, because it's not so easy even to think of a good solution to implement, but we are trying to do so, and I think it's so important, as he said, that we make the ground to stakeholders, to associations, to manage associations. I think we have a lot of work in advance, but we are winning at this point, and we have to take care of the rest of the implementation. But we are at a good point.
Thank you. You make me feel as optimistic as you.
Maybe the mic can go there, and then Pauline can have a comment first.
Just to complement what Iben just said, one of the things that you're describing, Luis, is that this battle for the ages we're entering in the audiovisual sector. In Göteborg, the festival, the Nostradamus report, which projects the future of our industry each year, was published a couple of days ago, and basically it's really dark. It says that it's going to be an awful year for people in the European audiovisual sector. And the reason why that is going to be the case is because we have new streaming platforms coming to our market, which are very hungry in terms of intellectual property, and that clashes completely with the fact that authors have intellectual property as well. So the tension to push authors in a situation where they relinquish everything through buyouts is, of course, very strong, and has been in practice in Europe over the last 5 years. I've heard a lot about this, filmmakers, as you say, it's been going on a lot, for sure. But what the directive does is that it creates a situation where these platforms are going to look for legal certainty when they use works. And the directive introduces something new, which is not going to be very clear until everything is properly implemented at national level. That gives us a shot to redress that situation, both in law and in practice, by collective negotiations, or even better negotiation of individual contracts if it comes to that. So what the directive provides as well is this notion of readjusting the legal framework in a way which is secure, which means that it has to be consistent with the directive and what we hope is the spirit of the directive. So I think we should all see the directive as it's a chance. It's a chance for us to fight a little bit back in situations where individuals have been pressured, but it will come to nothing if we do nothing. So having rights is great, but if you don't fight for it, if you don't enforce it, it's useless, right? So for me, the next step will be to think about sanctions, enforcement measures beyond just new legislation and new agreements. It's going to have to be what happens if you don't respect all of this, and then what our thinking needs to be in enforcement.
Thank you. Can we go to the next question?
Yes, my name is Jörg Evers. I'm a composer, and I refer to what Simon has said. I think you mentioned this campaign, Your Music, Your Future. Did you?
I don't think
no.
I mentioned that.
You didn't do it, so I thought your future you were talking about.
It's about your future, yeah, that's right.
As you know, there was a campaign which has helped to turn down the trials from Discovery to get rid of to establish the buyouts, and this was a very successful campaign called Your Music, Your Future. It was supported by SIAM, and this was supported by EXA, and this helped that Discovery Channel has forgot about the buyouts. It was very successful, and my good news is now that a couple of days before we had the SIAM EXCO meeting, and there was Gadi Oron attending, the chief of CSAC. CSAC is a roof organization of all the CMOs, and they decided and have already prepared an alignment with CSAC with Your Music, Your Future, and in the next couple of days or weeks there will be united campaign called Your Music, Your Future with the CSAC logo on. And all those CMOs you see there and additional CMOs which are members of CSAC will support it. And I think that's a strong voice fighting against buyouts.
Excellent. That sounds great. Yeah, John, should we now do the final question? If John can get a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, once again, I don't want to ask a question. I want to make a statement or perhaps give some encouragement, because we're talking about participation in revenues, money, which is one of the main things that we talk about most of the time, but it's very, very important. But one thing which we mustn't neglect and must see that our partners, it's not always about the money, it's about the convenience of the rights that we give to them. When somebody has a total buyout, they don't have they have the money on one side, but they have this total flexibility of use, and that's something very valuable for them. So we must be very careful, not just to concentrate on that aspect, but to also to give them convenience. And I think convenience must be one of our buzzwords for our CMOs, because in protecting our interests, sometimes they will go a little bit too far and not give the flexibility needed, thereby excluding some possible deals or making it easier, perhaps for negotiators, to give them something. So I think that when you want to have something to negotiate with, to make compromises, that is on that side, to make it easier to be able to deal with our license than just talking about the money all the time. Thank you.
Thank you. So, like, financial compensation can happen in many ways. I think we've reached the end now. Thank you so much for following us this last hour. And I hope, Iban, you've given us a great picture of a tree with big branches. It's going to be filled with leaves and hopefully some fruit as well, apples and pears. So thank you so much for participating in the panel and for your views and your insights on this matter. So give them a big applause. Thank you.
And thank you not only to this panel, to all speakers, all panelists. No, please, you are free to go if you want to. Otherwise, I will be very short. I just want to thank all of you and also our colleagues for participating here so actively, our sponsors, of course. And I want to say that you've added today to a proud tradition of the Creators Conference. And today we've been talking about fair remuneration, this difficult world, but it's really about the value of culture and the value of music from so many different aspects. And on this stage, at the Creators Conference, we've had colleagues from all over the world supporting us, and it's important that we continue supporting them. We've had Paul Brickhill explaining not only to us but to the policymakers of the EU about the importance of fair remuneration in Zimbabwe, not in order to be able to live a more luxurious life, but to be able to actually work professionally and sometimes even criticize maybe a government or something else. But this, in order to do that, you need to be able to work professionally. We've had representative parts of the Pussy Riot on this stage at the Creators Conference, explaining the importance of what we do and what they do for freedom of expression and artistic freedom. So there are so many aspects to why we need to support a creative Europe. And a creative Europe without creators? I don't think so. So I really want to thank you all for your support. And I have a very positive feeling of everyone here really wanting to contribute. And we are talking about facts, sometimes about details, and not about, as we said earlier today, about using slogans like breaking the internet and things like that. We're beyond that. Now we need to make it work. And we can only do that if we do it together. I'm so glad that you took the time and that you had the energy to keep awake during all of this session. And I want to inform you that we will now have a small reception for an hour. We, and also Pepper the robot, please feel free to talk to him. And after that, I hope you will all stay for a special event where we will honor one of our very special colleagues, a fantastic film music composer who certainly knows the value of music and that has been a great help also to our organization prior. So stay for that. I can promise you that you will hear fantastic music and you will be here for a good reason. So please enjoy.